This year, it is our tremendous pleasure to honor Representative Patrick Kennedy for his incredible and long-standing and substantial impact on the way in which we support mental health problems.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. Thank you very much, Dr. Crystal. You may be wondering why it is that I took such an interest in meeting with all these new psychiatrists, and I thought, listen, I've been paying enough for mental health care all these years. I wanted to get to know people at the very beginning of their careers, hopefully get a little free help along the way. So it was just an investment in my time. But these are our heroes. For any of us who have benefited from mental health, the people who practice in the area of mental health, who serve people who are in distress, are our lifesavers. And to Yale, to Dr. Crystal and all the staff here, to NAMI and all the advocacy that you provide to the commissioner, you are our first responders. You're the ones that come to our aid when we're in need of help to escape the feeling of desperation and depression and anxiety that so many in this country face on a daily basis, and so few have those knocking at their door to help them find the ways of escape. What we're doing now in this country is not only leaving millions of Americans to suffer in silence, we're leaving our American heroes, those who stood up and were willing to put their lives on the line for all of us to save us from another terrorist attack. These are our young men and women who serve in our nation's military, who are willing to make the greatest sacrifice any one of us could ever make. That's our own lives. And these young men and women went over there to protect us, and now they've come home. And many of them, right now as we speak, are prisoners. They're prisoners of their war injuries, prisoners of war. And we need first responders. We need the 911 force that's going to go in there and set them free from being prisoners of their war experience, hostage to the disability that comes from suffering from traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. When I look out to a crowd of mental health providers and neuroscientists, I say they're our new heroes, because they're going to go in there and kick down the doors of discovery, open up the light of escape, and allow our young men and women, our nation's heroes, to make it out from behind the enemy lines of stigma and discrimination, behind the enemy lines held hostage by the disability that comes from suffering from traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I believe, because the signature wound of this war on terrorism is the brain, and because the one group in this country that isn't stigmatized when it comes to brain disorders, our nation's veterans, that once again they're going to become our freedom fighters. Maybe initially unbeknownst to them, but just as they stood overseas and stood up against terrorism, they're coming home, and if we get behind the efforts to set them free, they're going to set all Americans free. In a very real way, they stood up against terrorism. They're going to stand up against terrorism again. The terrorism of living with these kinds of challenges because of the invisible wounds of war that they face. And frankly, what they're going to do is going to be the ones that are going to make the changes necessary that are going to set all Americans free from similarly being held prisoner, both in their minds and prisoner in their communities because of stigma. The great problem of this challenge is that not only do people suffer from a physical illness, but we've added insult to injury because of discrimination. And where does that discrimination emanate from? It emanates from ignorance. And hasn't it always been the case in our country's history where discrimination stems from misunderstanding, stems from the kind of prejudice that feeds off of that misunderstanding? So if we bring greater transparency and light to the issues of the brain, I believe, just as we've done in past battles against discrimination, we're going to end the kind of discrimination that feeds off of this uncertainty, this misrepresentation of things, and this stereotype. And that is why the kind of work that all of those who are doing here at Yale to unmask the mysteries of the brain and try to bring greater understanding is going to bring that light that will be the disinfectant on this terrible stigma and discrimination that pervades in this country. Before I go any further, I'd like to make a small mention of the fact that it was told to all of you that I got involved as the youngest member of the state legislature in Rhode Island. I was just old enough to run at 21. Then I ran for Congress, and I was the youngest member of Congress when I ran then. Well, I just want to set the record straight a little bit. In my family, when you're growing up, instead of bringing an apple to your teacher, you go to your teacher in the third grade and you say, "I promise you a living wage." And then as you get a little older in my family, the homework assignment that you're given is to find out when the Iowa caucuses are and New Hampshire primary for President of the United States. We do things a little differently. But I can tell you, when I see President Oriola here, who's the head of NAMI, aren't we lucky, those of us who've been blessed, to have family members that love on us, even when we're suffering from such a stigmatizing illness. And to think that his daughter had him as a father and her mother to respond to her illness just recalls for me what it was like in my family to have loving family members respond to me in the same way. We can find all the cures neurologically that are out there, but at the end of the day, the greatest therapy, the greatest assistance that anyone can get is love. And so I want to thank you for your and in that regard, I want to acknowledge some of my family that have been my first responders, beginning with my brother Ted, who's actually from this area. And you may have heard of his name before, Ted Kennedy. He gets a laugh every time. You know, my father was given all kinds of accolades for his work on health care. But my dad didn't look upon it as health care, didn't look upon it as health insurance, didn't look upon it as medical. All he saw it was, how do I keep my son alive? How do I keep the person that I love most in my life? If we looked at neuroscience, science in general, if we looked at medical care not as issues, but as the simple fact that we're just trying to find a way to keep the people we love in our lives closer to us and healthy, we wouldn't have a debate on how much money we're going to spend on this, because who wouldn't want to keep their loved one in their life living happily and in a quality of life. So, in a real sense, it's all personal to all of us. That's why we're talking about, research. That's why we're talking about healthcare. It's just a means to the end, and that's to show the people we love how much we love them because we want them in our lives. And the person who's been his first responder and the love of his life is my sister-in-law, Kiki Kennedy, who you may know. Yeah, Teddy was so interested in getting good mental health care, he married the best mental health provider he knew. Now, I got lucky too. People say, well, why'd you leave Congress? Well, I left for a number of reasons, among which I feel like I have been given an opportunity to live a new life, and I have a new life with the project manager that I refer to. I'm her project. And that's my fiance, Amy. And her parents are here. And Jerry and Lainey, thank you very much for joining us. And my partner in this effort of One Mind, Garen Staglin, who's the one who gets everybody laughing and giggling because he feeds them his wine. That's Garen Staglin right here. I really can just tell you an anecdote, and that is when I got elected to Congress, I was the youngest member from the smallest state, that's that state just north of here, Rhode Island, in the minority party, because we had just lost the House in '94. And yet I got to become the #1 signatory and sponsor of mental health parity. It tells you a little bit about, well, thank you. If you want to know a clearer way to explain discrimination and stigma of this illness, just understand that in Congress, if it's a popular bill, the senior members all put their names to it. And if it's the powerful people, I want to be associated with that. So it was left to the youngest member from the smallest state in the minority party to be the primary sponsor of mental health parity. That's how much that was popular. Another anecdote I want to tell you is when I went to rehab myself while I was a member of Congress, I got numerous letters of support from many of my colleagues that I didn't really spend much time with on the floor of the House, many of them from the other side of the aisle. And I got an amazing number of these notes. And when I came back, I went around to their offices and thanked them personally for their caring about me. And the stories that I heard are like stories I've heard all across this country when I traveled with my co-sponsor, Jim Ramstad, to pass mental health parity. And those stories were of personal anguish because of all of those colleagues of mine who have their own stories but can't ever feel free talking about them. I heard stories about parents who had committed suicide. I heard stories about spouses who had attempted suicide. I heard stories about children who had eating disorders. And the real poignancy of how powerful this discrimination and stigma is that when we came to the vote on mental health parity, a lot of these same people who told me the most powerful stories in their own families of this illness voted no. Voted no because to them, the notion of saying yes would invite political criticism, not because, they made the wrong vote politically, but because someone would now ask them, why did you vote yes on that? Do you have something wrong with you? Is there something wrong in your family we don't know about? And hence they were afraid. I had one very honest colleague of mine said to me, if I say yes to this vote, they might find out my daughter has an eating disorder and she's been hospitalized 3 times. And I worry they're going to blame it on me as her father because, frankly, I don't think I spent enough time with my daughter because I'm in politics. And I'm afraid all of that will come out. So to give you an idea of what we're up against, we're not only up against the science, we're up against this monolith of misunderstanding and stigma. And yet, I think it is a civil rights fight because people are marginalized in this country because of the immutable fact that they have a physical illness through no fault of their own that now they're stigmatized for. And they're marginalized in our society. You look at people, even if the acceptance is great for the neurobiology, this is a physical illness for people with Alzheimer's or autism, or very clearly understood in our society, physical, even they are marginalized because of stigma. So you can imagine issues like schizophrenia and depression and alcoholism and depression. These are issues that have a great deal more stigma, but let's not misunderstand. All brain-based illnesses have stigma. And just as my uncle, when he was the first president to address the issue of civil rights as a moral issue, said, "Who amongst us would trade the color of their skin and be content with the counsels of patience and delay?" If you have a friend or a loved one who's suffering in silence because of a mutable characteristic that is physical to them, just as real as the color of their skin, and they are marginalized and prevented from living out the fullness of the American dream because of that discrimination, how is this not also an issue of civil rights for Americans with mental illnesses and neurological disorders? And if these freedom fighters, our soldiers, went overseas to save us, and when they come home, the best thing we can do to many of them is lock them up in our prisons because of their untreated, invisible wounds of war, what kind of nation are we that we look the other way while the incarceration rates start to climb and the suicide rates become enemy number 1 for our military? You know, we would think of nothing of putting the full might of military power behind saving any one of our soldiers if they were caught behind the enemy lines of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. We would use the superpower strength of our military to go in there and set them free. And do you think one member of Congress would say, how much is that going to cost to set an American soldier free from being prisoner of war? No one would ask that. And you know what? If they're held behind enemy lines here at home of their invisible wounds of war because they stood the line for us, why shouldn't we put the full might of our country's power into going in there and setting them free and bringing them home, not only in body, but bringing them home in mind as well? So I want to say the One Mind campaign is an effort, simply put, to use the metaphor of my uncle's moonshot address 50 years ago, this May 25th, where he said, "We'll put a man on the moon, return him safely before the decade is out." And back then people said, to go to the moon, to land a man, let him walk, come back on the space capsule and return him safely. A scientific feat back then. People thought he was fantasy land to try to make that promise. But he said, that is our goal. Now people say that unraveling the mysteries of the mind, there's going to be 1,000 moonshots. But we are at a point in American and scientific history where we have all the tools at our disposal to do this. We have the computational capacity. We have the imaging capacity. We have the genomics. We have the researchers. The only length of time that it's going to take is the length of time it takes us to put our minds to this task and accomplish it. When he issued that call, he was issuing a patriotic call to America to win for our country's national security. I can't think of anything more important to our national security than saving our men and women in uniform from what the terrorists have chosen to be their signature weapon, the improvised explosive device, the IED. You know why they're using those weapons? Because it's the way that they get to our brains. And they know this is the soft spot in asymmetric warfare, is to attack our brains. If we don't figure out a way to come to the aid of our soldiers who are trying to keep all of us safe, we are going to let them down, but we're also going to let all Americans down by not doing the kind of basic science research that's going to set not only our soldiers, but all of our civilians free as well. This is a patriotic call, because understand this, in an environment like we have in Washington, people with mental illness and neurological disorders don't rank very high on the order of priority. Who should rank on the top of that list? Our nation's heroes. What do they need? They need us to waste no time mapping all the basic science that's going to help give them the kind of restorative, regenerative research to bring them back in mind and body to our country. And I think that it is time that we put the call out to all of our colleagues in Congress, our representatives, our president, to say, let's be true to our soldiers and not leave them behind on the battlefield, because we may say the war is over, but the war is just beginning for these returning men and women. And when we go in there and help provide them the light that's going to allow them to escape this disability that they're suffering as a result of serving all of us, we're going to allow that light to shine on all American families whose needs are the very same: to map the brain, to explore the inner space of the mind, and to make sure that we take that step. Now, people don't understand, one of the great things in neuroscience is the step that those who are trying to step out of their wheelchair because of spinal cord injury would be willing to take if we repaired the spinal cord. I can think nothing more powerful of a moniker of this scientific discovery than to when Neil Armstrong said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," to say a veteran paralyzed because of their injury is able to take that first small step out of their wheelchair because neuroscientists were able to repair the spinal cord in the process of doing this basic science research on neuroscience. If you don't think that's as powerful a step as stepping on the moon, then I don't think we as Americans can call ourselves worthy of this challenge. I think that America will rise to this challenge. We need to put it to America that it's within our DNA to rise to this challenge, because we're about not only great advances in science, but we're most importantly about what that will produce, and that is freedom for all Americans to be part of the American dream. And let's pass a new type of civil rights legislation. Let's make sure we no longer discriminate against people with mental illnesses. Thank you very much.